You've seen the guillotine in paintings. Clean, quick, almost tidy. But that's the lie history tells to make us comfortable. Because Marie Antoinette didn't start dying at the scaffold. They began killing her weeks earlier, quietly, deliberately, one humiliation at a time. Imagine going from Versailles to a cell so damp the walls sweat, from silk to straw, from Your Majesty to a number. And the worst part, they didn't just want her dead, they wanted her unmade. Not a queen, not even a mother, just a body that belonged to the revolution. And here's what people rarely say out loud. The cruelty wasn't only physical, it was psychological, surgical, designed to break her spirit in public and in private. Because before they cut her neck, they cut something else first. They took her child. And the night they did it, something inside her cracked that never healed. And it set the stage for the most vicious accusation of the entire trial. They didn't knock politely. They didn't explain. They just came in. Boots, lantern light, and the sound of authority pretending to be justice. It was still dark when they dragged her from what was left of her family. No farewell that mattered. No moment to hold her children like a mother, not a symbol. Only orders, only hands on her arms. Only the message, you're not a person anymore. They took her to the Conciergerie, Paris's waiting room of the guillotine. A place that didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a slow burial. Her world shrank to a cramped, wet cell. Dripping ceilings, sweating stone, a candle that trembled like it was afraid to stay lit, straw for a bed. And then the rule that was meant to finish her, constant watching. 2 guards, day and night. She dressed under their eyes, slept under their eyes, ate under their eyes. It wasn't security, it was humiliation dressed up as procedure. But the real torture had a name, Louis Charles. Because she kept expecting to hear his footsteps, to feel his small hand find hers in the dark. Instead, she had only the memory of his screams, the night they ripped him away while she begged them to stop. And what they made that little boy do next was going to be used to destroy her in front of all of France. In that cell, time stopped behaving like time. It didn't move in hours, it moved in sounds. Keys, boots, the scrape of a bowl against stone. And somewhere beyond those walls, Paris learned to chant her name like a curse. Inside, she tried to stay human in tiny ways. A straight back, a quiet voice, controlled breathing when her chest wanted to collapse. But they were hunting for something else, a moment of weakness they could display like a trophy. She had almost nothing left. Yet she hid the kind of treasure that could get her punished. A tiny portrait, a lock of hair. Not jewels, not letters from kings. Proof that she was still a mother. Sometimes a young attendant showed her small kindness, broth, a few gentle words. And that's when the mask slipped. Not the queen's mask, the mother's. She'd whisper her children's names like a prayer that hurt. The guards noticed, of course they did. They mocked her. They joked about her dead husband. They watched her face the way people watch an animal they're waiting to break. But she didn't give them the breakdown they wanted. That's what made them escalate. Because in the revolution's eyes, killing her body wasn't enough. They needed the crowd to believe she deserved it. They needed a crime so disgusting that mercy would feel like betrayal. So they went to the only thing still connected to her heart. The boy they'd taken from her arms. And they began shaping him into a weapon pointed at his own mother. Picture an 8-year-old boy alone in a hostile world, surrounded by men who called themselves liberators. They didn't need him to understand. They only needed him to repeat. They isolated him, pressured him, broke him down until words weren't words anymore, just noises that earned relief. A nod, a pause in the shouting, a night without punishment. And then they wrote the script they really wanted, a confession so vile it would poison the public's mind forever. Back in cell 280, she didn't know the details yet, but she felt the absence like a missing limb. Every day she woke up expecting the door to open and someone to say, "You can see him." It never happened. Instead, she got silence and stares. The tribunal wasn't a court, it was a theater. They wanted spectators. They wanted outrage. They wanted a villain. When they finally dragged her out for trial, she walked through those corridors in the same black dress she'd worn to mourn her husband, not because it would save her, because it was the last thread of meaning she controlled. Torches flickered, faces blurred together. She sat on a plain wooden bench while the prosecutor performed like a man auditioning for applause. Treason, conspiracy, starving the nation, corrupting France. Each accusation was tossed to the crowd like meat. And then, when the room was hungry enough, they dropped the charge that made even hardened revolutionaries shift in their seats. Incest. A blade made of words designed to cut deeper than steel. They said her own son had confessed. They said he named her. And for a second, the entire hall leaned forward to watch her finally shatter. She didn't scream, she didn't faint, she didn't plead. At first, she didn't even move, like her mind had stepped away from her body to survive what it just heard. Because that accusation wasn't meant to win a case, it was meant to erase her. They'd already taken her son, now they're using him like a knife, forcing a child's broken words into the mouth of the crowd. The revolution didn't just want her dead, it wanted mothers to turn their faces from her. The judges waited, the prosecutor watched her like a man savoring a kill, and the spectators, some cheering, some silent, held their breath. And then she stood, not toward the men in power, not toward the jury, she turned toward the women in the room. Market women, wives, mothers, people who understand what it means to love a child so hard it hurts. And she said, clear and steady, the only defense that mattered. I appeal to all the mothers who are here. That was it. No long speech, no elaborate argument. Just one sentence that slammed into the room like a door closing. Something shifted. You could feel it. A murmur, a crack in the certainty, a few eyes dropping away in shame. For a heartbeat, she wasn't a symbol. She was a mother being publicly mutilated. The prosecutor rushed to smother that moment, pounded forward with more witnesses, more stories, more theater, but the spell had been broken. 2 days later, at dawn, they read the verdict like it was paperwork. Guilty. Death. And when they asked if she had anything to add, she didn't fight the tide anymore. What more could I say? They marched her back to the cell, and that's when the strangest part began. The night before execution, when she became calmer while everyone around her grew crueler. Because at sunrise, they wouldn't just take her life. They would strip her in ways most people never hear about. That last night, the cell felt smaller, as if the walls knew what morning was bringing. The dripping water sounded like a clock that didn't care. The guards paced like they were bored, and she sat there, pale, exhausted, but strangely clear. No dramatic breakdown, no bargaining with God for one more day. Instead, she asked for a quill, and in that weak candlelight, she wrote what you write when you realize the world has decided you're a monster, and nothing you say will change it. A goodbye that's almost too human to read. Not revenge, not rage, forgiveness. She begged her sister-in-law to care for her daughter. She spoke of her son, still alive somewhere, still being used, still trapped, and she refused to blame him for the words they'd forced into his mouth. That's the part that hurts most. They weaponized her child, and she answered with mercy. But even that mercy was stolen. The letter never reached the hands it was meant for. It was seized, filed away, buried like evidence in an archive of hatred. Then came the footsteps, the bolts, the tone of a man announcing breakfast. It's time. And with that sentence, the final ritual began. The one designed to turn a former queen into a public object. They brought in the executioner. They brought in officials. They brought the cold efficiency of a system that wanted her reduced to procedure. First order, change clothes. She asked for privacy. Just that, a shred of dignity. The answer was a laugh. And when they stepped closer with scissors, she finally understood. They weren't preparing her for death. They were preparing her for humiliation. Your hair must be cut. It sounds small until you remember what hair meant then. Not fashion, not vanity, identity, womanhood, status. She didn't argue. She lowered her head like someone offering the last thing she owns. The scissors weren't gentle. They hacked. Strands fell onto the floor. Pale, lifeless pieces of a life that used to be untouchable. And then they brought the rope. "We must bind your hands." She looked up, confused in a way that was almost innocent. "Why?" she asked. "The king was not bound." No explanation, no respect, just a rope tightening around her wrist until it bit into skin. That was the point. The revolution didn't want her to walk to the scaffold like a person. It wanted her displayed like a captured thing. They put her in a plain white gown, rough linen, the color of penitence. No black mourning dress, no last link to her husband. Even grief was something they wouldn't let her keep. When the door opened to take her out, the corridor swallowed her in echo and whispers. Some guards couldn't meet her eyes. Not because they pitied her, because something about her still demanded silence. Outside, the cart was waiting. Not a carriage, not a closed coach like her husband had been given. An open wooden wagon, the same used for thieves, for murderers, for anyone meant to be mocked on the way to death. Paris was already awake. You could hear the crowd before you could see it, like an ocean of hunger. She climbed into the cart without help. Wrists tied, hair shorn, dressed like a stranger. And as it jolted forward, the city began to close in around her. This wasn't just a ride. This was a parade. And the people who came to watch weren't all there for justice. Some were there for something darker, to see if the monster would finally look afraid. The cart creaked through Paris like a slow sentence being read out loud. An hour, just over an hour, of being stared at, pointed at, spat at, bread thrown like insults, names shouted like stones, Austrian, widow, thief. And she stayed upright. That's what unsettled people. Not defiance, not arrogance, silence. Her face didn't perform for them. No tears for the crowd to drink. No panic to justify their hatred. Wind pulled up a cheap white fabric. The chopped hair exposed her neck, already being offered to the blade in advance. Some watched with pure joy. Some watched with something they didn't want to admit. Discomfort. From a balcony, an artist sketched her. Not because he loved her, because he understood he was witnessing a symbol being rewritten in real time. Then, the cart jolted hard over stone. She stumbled. A ripple moved through the crowd, the collective inhale of people hoping the mask finally breaks. But she steadied herself alone and straightened, as if even gravity wouldn't be allowed to humiliate her. That single movement said something dangerous. You can take everything from me and still not own me. And then the street opened up. The noise changed shape. Not scattered shouts now, one thick, boiling roar. Because ahead, rising above the sea of bodies, stood the silhouette everyone had been waiting for. Dark wood, metal gleam, the guillotine. And the moment she saw it, the story turned again. Because what she did next wasn't what the crowd expected from the most hated woman in France. The cart stopped. For a second, the world felt suspended, like even the air was holding its breath. The guillotine towered there, simple and brutal, its blade catching light like a cold eye. People surged forward, hungry for the final image they'd carry home. The executioner stepped down first. Assistants moved with practiced speed, like workers setting a stage. Someone reached a hand up to help her from the cart. She looked at him, calm, almost distant, and said softly, "No, thank you. I can manage on my own." It wasn't pride. It was control. The last scrap of it. She climbed down with bound wrists, feet finding the ground on their own. And as she approached the wooden steps, the roar of the crowd seemed to flatten into one constant sound, like the city itself was vibrating. Step, step, step. Each one felt like a closing door. At the top, the executioner moved to guide her. In that tight space with rope and linen and wooden boards on their foot, her shoe brushed his. A tiny accident, a nothing moment. But watch what happens when a human being has been stripped of everything. They reach for the one thing still theirs. She turned and said, clear as a bell, and almost gentle, "Forgive me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." An apology to the man about to kill her. That sentence hit the square harder than any scream could, because it proved what the revolution spent months trying to deny. She was still a person. And then the assistants took her, hands on shoulders, arms, guiding her toward the board. The crowd leaned in, because now we were seconds away from the moment everyone remembers, and about to miss the part that matters most. They laid her onto the wooden plank. Rope, hands, a practice routine that moved too fast for grief. The world narrowed to wood grain, rough fabric, and the sound of a mechanism being readied. Somewhere in the mass of faces, a shout rose, "Long live the Republic!" And the crowd answered like thunder. But even then, she didn't give them the reaction they wanted. No pleading, no curse, no last-minute bargaining, just stillness. The executioner gave a signal. Metal snapped, a harsh, final sound, like a door slamming in a stone hallway. And the blade fell. For the crowd, it was victory, a neat ending, a monster removed. For her, it was release. They lifted her head to show the square. A wave of cheering rolled outward, violent and satisfied. And then, just as quickly, the moment dissolved. People turning away, already moving on to the next spectacle, the next rumor, the next enemy. Her body was carried off like refuse. No royal burial, no ceremony, no tenderness. Thrown into a mass grave where names didn't matter. And yet, the revolution didn't get what it wanted most, because the thing they tried to erase, the humanity, leaked through anyway. In a damp cell, in a stolen letter, in a mother's single sentence in court, and in one final, quiet apology. They could bury her bones, but they couldn't bury the question her last days leave behind. If humiliation was the point, why did she look like the only person in that story who still had dignity? Here's the twist history rarely sits with. The guillotine didn't end the cruelty. It only ended the noise. Because after the cheering faded, the revolution tried to do something even colder than killing her. It tried to make her disappear. No marked grave, no cross, no place for her daughter to kneel one day and say, "Here, this is where my mother rests." Just earth packed down over mixed bodies, queens beside strangers, all reduced to anonymity. And for years, that worked. Officially, she was a closed chapter, a solved problem, a warning. But symbols don't stay buried. Time did what crowds never do. It got quiet enough for nuance to return. The revolution began devouring its own heroes. Names that once commanded fear met the same blade. And slowly, the story of Marie Antoinette shifted again. Less monster, more mirror. Decades later, when the monarchy returned, a search was ordered. They went digging in that forgotten cemetery. Mud, bones, scraps of cloth. And remains believed to be hers were recovered and moved to Saint Denis, the burial place of French kings. A delayed restoration of dignity that arrived too late to matter to the woman, but not too late to matter to the myth. Yet, even that isn't why people still talk about her. They talk about her because horrifying wasn't just the death. It was the methodical stripping beforehand. Privacy, motherhood, identity. Until only one thing remained. Choice. And in the last days of a life everyone wanted to turn into a lesson, she chose something that still unsettles people. Not vengeance, not hatred. A kind of grace that made her enemies look smaller than the prisoner they caged. So when people ask, what did they do to Marie Antoinette before the guillotine? Don't picture just a courtroom and a cart. Picture a strategy. They took a woman the public already resented and turned punishment into entertainment.
They replaced law with spectacle, and they understood something terrifying about crowds. If you repeat a story loudly enough, people will crave the ending, even if the story is built on cruelty. They erased her name into a number. They locked her in damp stone and called it justice. They denied her privacy, so her body would never feel like it belonged to her. They ripped away her child, then used that child's forced words to accuse her of the unthinkable. They cut her hair, bound her hands, dressed her in penitence, and displayed her to the streets, all before the blade ever moved. And then, after all that, they expected the final image to be fear. Instead, the world got something else. A mother who appealed to other mothers, a condemned woman who apologized to her executioner, a human being who refused to become the monster they needed. That's what makes what came before the guillotine so horrifying. Not because it was dramatic, because it was deliberate. And it leaves you with one last question that sticks long after the video ends. If a society can be trained to enjoy humiliation, how do you even recognize the moment it starts happening again?
And that's why her story isn't just history, it's a warning wrapped in a name. Because the scariest part of the Marie Antoinette saga isn't the guillotine's blade, it's how many people convinced themselves they were watching something righteous. They told themselves she deserves it. They told themselves it's necessary. They told themselves it's justice. Meanwhile, the real pattern was simpler and uglier. First, turn a person into a symbol. Then, turn the symbol into a villain. Then, make the villain's suffering feel like entertainment. By the time the cart rolled, most of Paris wasn't looking at a woman. They were looking at a story they'd already agreed to believe. And Marie Antoinette, flawed, privileged, complicated, still managed to expose the lie in the final stretch. Not with power, not with armies, with the only thing left when everything is confiscated: composure, restraint, and one unmistakably human sentence. So if the title promised something horrifying before the guillotine, here's the payoff. They didn't just execute her, they rehearsed it, they choreographed it. They tried to erase her identity so completely that the crowd would feel clean afterward. But the opposite happened, because centuries later, we don't remember the prosecutor's lines. We don't remember the crowd's chants. We remember the mother. We remember the dignity. We remember the moment she wouldn't give them what they came for. And that's the part they never planned for. If you strip away the costumes and the century, what's left is brutally familiar. A public that's tired, angry, and looking for someone to blame. Leaders who understand that outrage is fuel. A machine that turns rumors into truth just by repeating them. Marie Antoinette became the perfect target because she was distant and visible at the same time. Rich enough to envy, foreign enough to distrust, powerful enough to hate. And once that story locked in, everything that happened to her could be justified as necessary, even the things that should have disgusted everyone, especially that accusation in court, because it wasn't just meant to condemn her, it was meant to contaminate her so thoroughly that compassion would feel shameful. That's the real horror, how fast basic decency becomes unpopular. But there's another reason her final days still haunt people. Because she shows what happens when a human being is pushed past the point of saving. When you realize you won't be rescued, something changes. Fear stops negotiating. Your body still hurts, but your mind stops begging. And in that strange, quiet space, after the last hope dies, some people collapse. She didn't. She took the last scraps of herself. Motherhood, faith, manners, restraint, and held them like a candle in a damp cell. Not to win, to refuse the transformation her enemies demanded. And maybe that's why her story survives, because even in the middle of a cruel crowd, one person's dignity can still make everyone else feel exposed. So when you replay her final days in your head, don't start at the scaffold. Start at the moment the door shuts and the human life becomes prisoner 280. Start at the drip in the ceiling, the straw bed, the guards who never look away. Start at the emptiness where a child used to be.
Because that's where the guillotine truly begins, in the slow dismantling of a person while the world pretends it's just procedure. And here's what makes it stick in your throat. They wanted her to die like a villain, but the closer she got to death, the more she looked like something else. Not a saint, not a monster. A woman who'd been cornered so completely that only her character was left to speak. That's why the line people remember isn't an insult. It isn't a scream. It's a mother's appeal and an apology. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good, because it means you're seeing the real story, not the convenient one. The guillotine ended her life in seconds, but what they did before it, that took weeks. And it was the part designed to make the public feel like cruelty was normal. So the next time you hear a crowd celebrating someone's humiliation, ask yourself a question that would have changed everything in 1793. Are we watching justice, or are we watching a person being unmade? And that's the final irony. The revolution tried to erase her. No name, no privacy, no mercy, no grave. A clean ending for an enemy of the people. But history doesn't work like a tribunal. It doesn't stop when the crowd cheers. Because the very cruelty meant to humiliate her became the reason she's remembered. Not as a glittering queen in Versailles, but as a prisoner who walked through hatred without giving it her soul. They stole her family. They stole her dignity in public. They tried to steal her humanity in court. Yet, when the moment came, the thing that echoed wasn't their shouting. It was her restraint, her composure, her refusal to become what they needed. That's why what they did before the guillotine is the real horror. It wasn't punishment. It was intentional degradation, slow, systematic, and socially approved. And if you felt your stomach tighten hearing it, that's not just sadness, that's recognition. Because every era has its scapegoats, every crowd has its story, and every system that turns humiliation into entertainment tells itself the same lie. This time, it's different. Marie Antoinette's last days whisper back from 1793 with a warning we still need. The line between justice and cruelty isn't the blade. It's the moment we stop seeing a human being.